Right. Okay, so most of people were in the waiting room are now with us. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon to this Cell and Gene Therapy Deals in Partnering webinar. So I'm going to keep looking on that right to keep admitting people who are coming. I'm going to leave the floor in a minute to Adrian Tutungi, partner at Taylor Wessing, who kindly put this panel together. But just before we start, as you may have heard, this session is recorded. So just to warn you of that. And I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping points because it's quite a large number of you attending, which is really good. So just to keep it as smooth and as interactive as possible, I will ask you if you could keep your camera and microphones off. So then we just focus on the panel discussion itself. But then obviously, because we welcome your insights and questions, if you have any, I will ask you to just prompt them in the chat box that is on your right-hand side, or if you don't see it, just roll over the bottom. There is a chat button and you can use that to then pose your question. I will pick up on them and pass them to the panel. We probably going to try to keep them for the end because there is a lot of topic to address just during the session and just seeing how the flow is going. So just a reminder for the ones who are joining us again, if you can keep your camera off, we're just going to keep the panel on at the moment and please send your questions in the chat box. So without further ado, leaving the Zoom floor to Adrian. Thank you, Adrian, for putting that really good panel together. I'm sure it's going to be lots of insights and information on this very exciting space that is cell and gene therapy. And welcome to the panel. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks very much, Aline. So as Aline said, everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this One Nucleus panel session in conjunction with Taylor Wessing. So our topic for today, again, as Aline has just said, is cell and gene therapy partnering and deal making, where now? And what we're going to be talking about are current trends in cell and gene therapy partnering and deal making, and in particular, how those deals differ from the more traditional modalities such as monoclonal antibodies. And although cell and gene therapies have been around for many years, and in fact, the ATMP regulation was adopted in Europe to create a regulatory pathway way back in 2007, it's only now that some of the therapies are thought to be sort of reaching their potential. And so there's been a marked increase in deal making over the last few years. And that's why One Nucleus thought that this would be a timely topic for discussion. So as Alina said, my name is Adrian Tutungi. I'm a transactional IT partner at Taylor Wessing, based in our Cambridge office. And I spend a fair amount of my time advising exactly on these types of partnerings and deals. I'm really pleased to be joined by an absolutely stellar panel who's kindly agreed to share their experiences and their insights with us today. So let me introduce them in turn. And in no particular order, we've got Michael Bennett, who is Business Development Director for Emerging Therapies at Kyowa Kirin, the Japanese pharma company. His previous roles include Director of Business Development at the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult here in the UK. And prior to that, he was VP BD and Licensing at Oxford Gene Technology. Then we have Kirsten Pappenfuss, who is Associate Director Therapeutics at Deep Science Ventures, which is an early stage VC and company formation specialist, again here in the UK. Kirsten's also an alumna of the UK Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, and one of her various roles there was University Liaison Manager. We have then got Connor Johnston, who is the General Counsel at Mogrify, an exciting Cambridge-based cell reprogramming company. Connor had previous roles at Cambridge Antibody Technology and then AstraZeneca and MedImmune. So he had a ringside seat in some of the middle years, I'll call them middle years, not the early years, of antibody development. Anna Gregson is joining us from Matheson Squire, where she's a partner and a patent attorney specializing in a number of areas of biotech, but in particular cell and gene therapy. And she's got extensive experience of advising clients on STO issues in particular for CAR-T. And then finally, we've got Chris Williams, who is VP Global Head of Business Development at Autolus, which is NASDAQ listed in a UCL spin-out, focusing on the development of various CAR-T programs. So today we're aiming for fairly free-ranging conversation. So we've got no slides at all, you'll be pleased to hear. Just to let you know where we're going and to signpost the discussion, we're going to touch on First of all, a brief outline of what we mean by cell and gene therapy, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Then we're going to talk about types of collaboration that we're seeing in the market. We're going to talk about differences in approach to due diligence and freedom to operate on those deals. And then our final two topics will be looking at trends in deal structures, including things like the stage of the asset, the values, and some differences in deal terms as well. As Aline said, we want the session to be as interactive as possible, so please do submit questions you've got. We've had a couple in advance already, which we will weave into the discussion. And then just three final standard disclaimers before we get into the substance of the discussion. First, we can't deal with any questions which are specific to one company, so ask them in general terms, and we might then be able to deal with them. The contents of the webinar should not be taken as legal advice, obviously. And then finally, all of the panelists today are speaking in their personal capacity and not on behalf of their respective organizations, companies, so please bear that in mind. So with that, let's get going. And to kick us off, Kirsten is going to give us an outline of what we mean by cell and gene therapy.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I've got the questionable job here to introduce what cell and gene therapies are, but looking at the audience, I think I'm probably preaching to the converted, so I'm going to keep this relatively short. Overall, there are three broad categories when you think about cell and gene therapies. So the first one is, I think, the easiest one to grasp is in vivo gene therapy, where you basically, in its easiest form, replacing a faulty gene with a healthy gene to correct a genetic phenotype. Of them, a couple of them have already approved and reached the market, and there's many more under development, but there are some early safety problems that have occurred recently. So there's one example by, for example, dentists who've been just showing that they have liver toxicity problems with their rare neuromuscular disease gene therapy. But there's others that have made it successfully to the market, and those are the ones that have been working mostly in closed systems. So just thinking about applications in the eye where you can directly inject to the site of action, and for example, Luxturna is an example here. So that's gene therapy. And then you have cell therapy, where you're talking about non-genetically modified cells. So that's your stem cell transplants for you. And that's the third category, is where it becomes all muddled up, because that's what we call ex vivo gene therapy, which then leads to a cell therapy. And a really good example is CAR T therapies, where you basically take the T cells out of the patient body and then, using an ex vivo gene therapy approach, equip them with a new function that they didn't have before you stick the cells back in to then have their therapeutic effect. Of them, 4 of them, I think, have successfully reached the market, and there is so many more under development, but I think Chris is much better placed to comment on all of this than I could possibly ever be. And then to muddy the waters even further, now these days also in vivo cell therapy is popping up. So these are approaches where people are using in vivo gene therapy to then in the human body create a cell therapy approach. And we have one company in the DSV portfolio that's trying to generate CAR T cells that way in the human body, which is called ImTune Therapies. But there's also US examples that are trying to do that, which are, for example, Umoja Therapies. So those are your broad categories, and there is a major difference to, even though they are classed as biologicals, how you move them forward to the market that you need to consider. So I think first and foremost, and we'll keep hearing this all over again today, are the manufacturing challenges that you have going alongside with your development of your cell therapies. So cell therapies are living things that you are basically putting into a patient, and just because you can make something at small scale and it keeps the phenotype, that doesn't actually mean you can do that at the large quantities that you need in order to have a therapeutic effect in the patient. So you need to check out whether the phenotype is still the same. Issues that arise are around dedifferentiation, activity, complex value change, thinking about freeze-thaw and all that kind of thing. So that is definitely a challenge that we'll hear more about. Then there is the market size, and that's definitely an issue that keeps popping up, especially for gene therapy approaches, because obviously the low-hanging fruit here are genetic disorders where you have a single gene that has gone all wrong. And yeah, people are going after these first because it's the perception is they are the easiest to fix. But then you're dealing with low and rare and ultra rare indications with a low market size. So you really need to determine early on whether you've got a viable market there. And sometimes people get that wrong, right? So Glybera is one of the products that was approved to the market, but has since been withdrawn because the market just wasn't viable. Then you have the issue of reimbursement. So you've probably heard everywhere that the cell and gene therapies are really ridiculously expensive, and the reimbursement pathways are still in their infancy. For example, for gene therapies, the price tags for, I think, Luxturna is about $400,000 per eye, and then you have two, so that makes it 800,000. And the perception is still that everybody wants to have a one-time payment rather than spreading it out over multi-year payments. So that's something that the reimbursement bodies are still looking in. Then you also need to consider from a reimbursement perspective that some of the indications that you might want to go after actually need humongous cell numbers to be able to actually fix them. And we won't ever be able to make those humongous cell numbers in indications that are more spread across the population. I don't think there is any health system in the world that could tolerate these prices. And and because of the price point, I think you need to also make sure that whatever you're producing is super efficacious. So you always will be challenged by the standard of care and have to really show early on that whatever you're developing is better, much better by a mile than the standard of care, because otherwise you will not have a commercial case to make. And ideally you want to be showing this early on in the process to be able to attract investment. And then another really key factor is also the safety. Because as compared to small molecules, which are basically gone after the day, or antibodies, which might hang around for a couple of weeks, these things are designed to hang around for ideally years, right? So that's not in line with current clinical trial design for safety. So you might only find out much later down the line whether you have a safety effect. And that's what makes everything a lot more complicated. And last but not least, there's obviously the ethics and the perception of the public, whatever people feel about, modifying somebody's DNA, and that's something that needs to be carefully managed. So that's CNG in a nutshell, I think.
Great, thank you, Kirsten, for that tour de force. Just coming back to the patient population size, Chris, we were talking earlier, the perception particularly for gene therapy is you have very ultra rare, so ultra rare or rare indications. But CAR T, for example, there are some approaches which focus on blood cancers with bigger, slightly bigger patient populations. Sort of, we're not talking 1 in a million, we're talking tens or hundreds of thousands, I think. And then you talk about solid tumors, CAR Ts that might prove efficacious in solid tumors as well. So there's a bit of a mixed message on patient size, population size. Is that right?
I think so. Before I answer your question, just to sort of add a point to sort of Kirsten's overview, I think why we're all here, why we're all working on these therapies, despite all of the challenges that Kirsten lists out, is they're transformational for patients. We've seen extreme efficacy, curative therapies, and we're here to sort of solve these challenges and make these difficult to deliver therapies simple for patients to receive. In terms of populations, I think there are the rarer populations where sort of AAV-directed gene therapy and some of the ex vivo CD34 therapies, the likes of Orchard and Bluebird Bio have been developing. You get into hematology oncology, the field that we're working in, acute leukemias sort of affecting maybe 10,000 patients in last line in the US and EU. And then something like prostate cancer, it's hundreds of thousands of patients in metastatic resistant prostate cancer in sort of third, fourth line across the EU and US. So some of these challenges are much more complex given those large patient populations that we need to address. So a lot of work to be done in that area. Yeah,
so a sort of a more nuanced picture. Michael, can I bring you in at this stage, and we'll just talk briefly about sort of a taxonomy of the types of deals that we're seeing in the market. I mean, clearly sort of the traditional partnering deal where it's asset-based, a company has developed an asset at some stage of development, and that could be discovery, it could be early stage, for example, preclinical or phase 1 or a later stage asset, and is then looking to partner it and effectively out-license it to another company which has the financial resources, but also sort of the regulatory expertise and marketing capability to complete development and then commercialize it. So we're still seeing those types of deals. That hasn't gone away, has it?
No, those types of deals haven't gone away, but there's a little bit more reticence about doing those kind of complete deals from the point of view that you've got to make sure you've got everything in the package, and that includes the manufacturing around any of the products. And if you don't have those types of elements and you have confidence around the manufacturing and how you're actually going to deliver it to the patient's bedside, then it becomes a much more difficult thing to transact. So if you go back in the day, lots of pharmaceutical companies were looking at single molecules, and that was relatively straightforward for them to think about because chemistry was chemistry. They knew how they would manufacture it. They were very skilled at putting things into pills and how to put them into packets and get them into the hospital. But then when you're thinking about a living therapy, it becomes much more complex, and it's completely outside the thinking of the large pharmaceutical companies who have the great routes to market. They're not used to thinking about cold chain and how you would actually get it into a hospital when you've got, bags of product that has to get there. And even more complex when you consider some of the products that Chris is working on, where they're autologous products. You've got to get cells from the patient in the first place. You've got to manipulate them in your own factory, and then get them back to the same patient. And when you're white gloving that sort of thing, so you may be only treating 10, 100 patients, that's relatively straightforward, if not still a little bit complicated. But as soon as you start to think about a bigger market, as Chris was talking about on prostate cancer, all of a sudden you've got tens of thousands of patients and you can't have any risk of mixing something up, especially if it's an autologous therapy. And so there's lots of different things to think about when you're doing the transaction that all have to line up. And so things can fall away quite quickly in due diligence, or they could fall away even earlier because the host originator of the therapy may not have those questions answered and is expecting the partner, the commercial partner, to help with it. And they may not have the skills either. So there's quite a lot to think about.
And are companies sort of trying to vertically integrate? So is there sort of more in-licensing as they try and piece together the different technologies, the complementary technologies they need, even going as far as sort of tracking technologies, leukapheresis technologies, those type of things? Or are companies not looking to vertically integrate, but just to partner and to collaborate and to move forward in that way?
I think you're seeing both. So you do get companies that are trying to vertically integrate. So if you go back in time and you think about the UPenn, Novartis type collaborations, Novartis made a manufacturing site very locally to them. And so they were trying to bring in all of those skills and develop them themselves. So trying to be everything. Whereas other smaller companies are trying to be a bit more nimble around what they're doing. One, because they don't have the money to vertically integrate, but they also can see that if they can choose the best partners and bring together a mosaic of skills from a variety of different places, that they may produce a better product, or it may be the best product or the best routes to market. So you're seeing a bit of both. And I really think it's driven by the size of the organization you're trying to do the transaction with.
Okay.
I think there's been a bit of a shift in the landscape as well. When Novartis started out, when Juno started out in cell therapy, there was no people to go to for help. But sort of 8-9 years later, the landscape has changed in terms of enablers and enabling companies in which you can collaborate with to sort of achieve a commercializable therapy. So it's kind of easier to be a follower than the first sort of companies moving out in this space.
And I think it's fair to say you can see the majority of CDMOs who manufacture biologics all now are working in cell and gene therapies as well, because it's an extension of a lot of the kind of core skills that they originally had for making biologics.
Yeah, and there's been quite a lot of activity in the CDMO space. So there've been quite a few transactions where 3 or 4 big CDMOs with with operations and cell and gene therapy have been acquired. So I think there are investors and there's capital which is thinking that they're going to be in demand as this modality moves forward and develops. Michael, before we move off types of deal, can we think a bit about the manufacturing aspects? Obviously, aside from developing the construct itself, when you get to the stage of commercialization, you're going to need to source potentially, for example, for CAR-T, a viral vector in quantity. So at the manufacturing stage, that seems to be being done by way of collaborations as well, in a way that perhaps we didn't see for monoclonal antibodies, where scale up and commercialization and manufacture took place internally. Is that right? Are we seeing these sort of manufacturing collaborations, and what are the commercial dynamics there?
So there's a variety of different dynamics. So you've got the dynamic where, for example, for Oxford Biomedica, where they own the intellectual property around lentiviral constructs. And so people want to buy into that if they possibly can for doing a variety of different things. And so that kind of drives a different kind of dynamic when you're then looking at a more generic CDMO, where you most likely are going to bring the vector that you're wanting to be manufactured to that CDMO and just telling them, this is how we want, this is the scale we want. They will then bring to bear their skills and scalability to that problem. And therefore you kind of, it's much more of a kind of a collaborative relationship. So you can sometimes be able to then take that manufacturing to a third party, and sometimes you can't. It depends on what you've negotiated with that particular organization. Whereas if somebody does have that core intellectual property, they want to try and keep that within themselves, and that's part of their sales promise, effectively, that their USP, that's what they're building their business upon. But it's something you've got to be really careful about when you're choosing who's going to manufacture, because you may be stuck.
Yeah, and presumably that dynamic is what drives whether it's going to be a fee-for-service model, whether it's going to be a sort of milestones and royalties model, or whether it's even going to be so integral to the final product that they can justify a profit share approach. Chris, have you seen that range? Is anything happening at the fee-for-service end, or is things not commoditized enough yet for manufacturing to have arrived there?
I think you do see a sort of range of different approaches on the commercial side. I've not seen it. The profit share example that you indicated, it's still a handful of experienced CDMOs that have taken a vector as part of a product all the way through to FDA approval. There's still a long way to go. So those expert ones, like Oxford Biomedica being one of those, are still highly sought after, and they're doing a tremendous job of building out that capability and platform, and which will only benefit the field in the long term. And Oxford Biomedica being around for before cell and gene therapy existed, right? So it's great to see how well they're doing.
The profit sharing model is a difficult one for the majority of CDMOs because the margins are so tight for them. It's a very competitive space, so it's going to be hard for them to make the investment off the back of maybe we'll make some money out of this when it comes to market.
Yeah, understood. So let's move on and think a bit about due diligence then when people are piecing these deals together. And Anna, Connor, can we spend a few minutes just thinking about how that takes place? What are you seeing and how is that approached? Anna, do you want to go first and share some thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you, Adrian. So I think from my perspective as a sort of an external patent attorney who works with a variety of sort of companies, institutions in this space, for me, the big challenge that I see the more facing is the complexity of the technology and how to devise or how to work with them to devise a strategy that is going to be effective and come in on time and in budget and give them results that will help them drive their sort of innovation. Because compared with sort of standard small molecule pharma or even sort of biologics like sort of monoclonals, the number of pieces to the jigsaw are so much greater, and trying to if we take the example of CAR T cells, for example, it's not just the T cell itself. You can think about, you know, the kind of the targeting moiety can be patented independently. The various co-stimulatory domains could potentially be protected independently. You know, if there are ways of improving efficacy, then those could potentially be protected independently. You can think about, you know, now it's not just a T cell. You can potentially have your CAR in a different cell type, such as a macrophage. The indication itself. There's you know, any sort of pre-treatment that you need to think about in terms of the patient, the vectors that you use to get these things into the cells, and the techniques that you use to get them in. There's so many different aspects, all of which you have to think about, and it can be very difficult to identify what is key to your particular clients, or, you know, do they need an overview across the whole spectrum, or can you really drill down to one particular area? It's a real challenge, and I think that is reflected in, so as well as the complexity in the technology, you also then have the complexity in terms of the applicants and the patentees that you have to consider in terms of the strategy as well, because there are an awful lot of players in this space, and the number of patent filings is maybe not increasing exponentially, but there's you know, it's rocketing in recent years. If you look at sort of from 2013 and the number of filings then to 2018, 2019, the growth that you're seeing there is across all key jurisdictions is massive. And you also have these nodal filing structures as well. So it's not just one applicant filing on a particular therapy, but you have collaborators and joint applicants, some of who cross over and have nexus and some don't. And so it's a very, very challenging landscape for companies to navigate. And I think for companies who maybe have previously been involved in other biologics, for example, it's a real learning curve, because the strategies that you use for those earlier sort of more standard biologics don't necessarily translate well or easily to advanced therapeutics such as cell and gene therapies. Carla, anything to?
Well, thanks. I mean, so firstly, I echo everything you just said. I think what you said is absolutely spot on. I mean, from my perspective, it's very much sort of biotech rather than biotech investor. And I think one thing that may be worth mentioning is that many of the companies that are wrestling with the challenges that Anna's already articulated are not big biopharma. They're relatively small size businesses. And whereas big pharma might have very significant budgets for broad landscape assessments and focused FTO work, that isn't the case for a lot of the smaller businesses, but yet they're having to navigate the same space. I mean, just drawing upon my own experiences back from Cambridge Antibody, as Adrian said, I was sort of joined Cambridge Antibody when it wasn't quite a newborn company, but there are a lot of the challenges are reminiscent. But as Anna has said, the key is the sheer level of complexity has increased, and I think, you know, when and I'm not speaking from Ogrify now, but from a practical perspective, any company that's attempting to develop a product as opposed to a platform, you've got to look all the way through from the technology that you're going to deploy in discovery, all the way through to the technology that you're going to need in order to deliver that product into a human. And as if all that wasn't bad enough, the landscape's not yet settled. There are competing claims from rights holders, and it's a really crowded space as well. I mean, I think it's challenging, but I guess the key from my perspective is you've got to pick your battles. You have to know that likely, particularly if you're a SME, you're going to be partnering with a bigger organization in a defined point in time. And hopefully they'll be able to take some of the weight off your shoulders. So you've got to focus on those technologies and systems, I guess, that will help you get to the point where you can achieve that partnering stage. Yeah, I guess that's really, I think the other thing is that maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but a lot of patents that are out there, of course, they're still in the application phase. So maybe I'm reassuring myself, but not all the claims that we're seeing on the registers are going to get granted ultimately.
Yeah, and sorry, Anna, I was just going to say, does that mean that obviously within the monoclonal space, for example, people developed an understanding of a landscape where the dominant patents were held? So the McCafferty patents, for example, in relation to phage display for discovery inventions, which Connor was mentioning, or the Winter patents in relation to humanization for the actual product itself. It sounds like people don't have that understanding at the moment about where the dominant families are. Is that because there aren't dominant families and the inventions are much more focused and narrow claims, or are there claims out there which potentially cover the whole space?
There are some broader filings out, or broader families out there, but I think it's, as Connor said, the situation is not settled. There is a great deal of flux, and so it is difficult to say with certainty that you can devise a sort of a manufacturing process and know for sure that you fall inside or outside when there is this degree of complexity. And I think you've kind of sort of, one of the points we were talking about before we kind of went live is that there was a lot of work going on before the patenting curve kicked off. So there's technology out there which is available, which is kind of maybe brought to bear during later litigation or contentious matters. So there's a lot of different pieces in play, and it's difficult. I think that's what everybody is struggling with. And I think Connor made a really good point about when smaller companies are looking to partner and looking for the larger partner to take on a share of the risk. That's certainly something that I'm seeing in terms of due diligence exercises and FTO exercises that I'm running, is that the appetite to risk for a potential commercial partner can be a significant weighting in terms of the deals that are there to be made, because the smaller companies just, and all the academic groups that are trying to license out or partner this technology, just don't have the wherewithal to take on that risk. And so they're really, all things being equal, if they have two potential partners and one of them is going to take on the share of the risk and help them with that, then that goes a long way. That goes a really long way.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. And presumably that will play out obviously in warranties and indemnities in relation to third-party IP in the agreement itself. So just a final thought before we move on from this topic. One of our questions beforehand related to the manufacturing space and whether it was likely that we would see dominant patents rising in relation to cell and gene therapy manufacturing. For example, the Caberly patent by comparison, which we saw in the monoclonal antibody space, which ended up covering virtually all monoclonal antibody manufacturing. It was a recombinant technique that was used very widely. It only expired in December 2018 for those who recall it. Generated huge amounts of royalties, almost $1 billion every year, I think, for the patentee, which was Genentech and then Roche, obviously, and City of Hope shared in that as well. Are we likely to see on the manufacturing side in particular, the question focuses on, are we likely to see that type of broadly applicable dominant patent emerging?
So in terms of manufacturing, there are some broadly applicable technologies that are used, but they're generic technologies. Now, whether the patent holders themselves appreciate that their technologies are being used in the development of these types of therapeutics is another thing. But I don't see them enforcing them against people. But whether that happens or not, always depends on whether they feel they're getting reasonable recompense for simply just selling their product. But there are some patents out there that do sweep across, and they can be very unusual in that you just wouldn't expect them to have got these broad claims across these very simple activities sometimes. And it could be something, I'm just pulling something out of the air, like filtration. And it can be something like that everybody uses, but don't actually realize that this another organization actually has control of that piece of intellectual property. So the more you look into it and the greater depth you look into it, as Anna has kind of suggested, that you have to, that you do start to uncover a variety of different things hiding that you really need to be aware of. And that's part of the risk profile that comes into play when you start to value some of these technologies. So as you were talking about some of the academics who may be trying to sell out their new therapy, they look around the marketplace and think, well, this must be worth X amount because so-and-so bought such and such a technology for tens of millions of pounds, but actually you have no idea about the freedom to operate. Therefore, the value is very different, and the value around it needs to be very, very different, which shapes the deal structure in itself.
Right.
From
Well,
Sorry,
Anna, go ahead.
One last point, from an FTO perspective, the generic technology that Mike was talking about is very difficult to track down, because you're looking at technology, you know, if you're working on a T-cell innovation, a CAR T-cell, that, you know, there may not be a sniff of a CAR T in that patent specification at all. Even some of the CAR T-cell specifications don't use the term CAR T-cell. They use some other terminology. They can talk about sort of specific T-cells or, you know, receptors, and they purposefully are ambiguous. So you have to kind of really try and come up with alternative strategies to find them. And that's something that, you know, you have to think about very carefully to make sure you sweep up everything, because even if you know it's unlikely that the rights holder is going to enforce it against you, your client should be aware that it is out there and it exists and is a potential issue, just so they have visibility. Right.
So keyword searching and sort of similar techniques don't work so well. Well, Michael, I won't put you on the spot to ask you who owns these generic or quite broadly applicable manufacturing patents. People can follow up in Q&A if they want to know. But if we move on, keeping an eye on time, to talk a bit about deal trends. And we were talking as a group between ourselves about some interesting data that Charles River produced in terms of analysis of deals over the last 5 years, and 2 or 3 trends they identified. The first one was that they were suggesting that there is, so the speed of big pharma entry into deal making space has been much quicker. What they call the rapid promotion phase of a technology. So the technology sort of initially bumps along the bottom, there's some interest, but no one's particularly interested in it. And then big pharma enters the market and there's a rapid increase, a take up in adoption and maturity of the technology. That time lag, according to the Charles River data, was about 20 years for monoclonals and is about 5 years for cell and gene therapy. So things seem to be moving much more quickly. Chris, Michael, is that reflected in what you're seeing on the ground?
I think from my point of view, I think that's been driven by the data we've seen in some of these early products. You know, if we talk about my field in heme-oncology, we put patients into complete remissions, long-term complete remissions, who were in their last months of life, and that had never been seen in those patient populations ever before. So people stood up and were interested, and Novartis got in there extremely early based on that amazing data. And then you saw kind of other large farmers come in, in a similar way. So I think sort of seizing on the potential for patient benefit, maybe that could have undermined their more established biologic franchises. Needs to be in it to win it, I guess. From a question.
I mean, biologics were a step up from a lot of small molecules when they first came on the marketplace. They were good, but building what Chris has said, you go and look at the Emily Whitehouse story. She was the first child treated with one of these therapies. She was within weeks of dying. She was cured. 2 weeks spent in a coma being treated, having a cytokine storm. 8 days later, they looked at her bone marrow. She had no malignant cells. It's astonishing. It shows the power of this technology and what it could really do and how curative it can really be. And that's driven the marketplace. The big pharma do not want to be left behind when you've got technologies that powerful. It's as simple as that. And so they're willing to invest. But the early investors into the marketplace, the Novartis of this world, had to spend time generating all the early data, which kind of worked on the normal kind of pharmaceutical development time pipeline. It was going to take 15 years, and that's what they were thinking about. All of a sudden, because these are curative therapies, you're suddenly starting to find products coming out after a phase 1-2 trial and getting reimbursed through a variety of different pathways simply because they're curative, and that creates the value. But then you've got to walk backwards in that and then think about all the other risks that Anna's just been talking about.
And one of the other trends that Charles River, sorry, Kirsten, did you want to come in? You looked as if you had
I disagree a little bit. So obviously everything is driven by these fantastic results and potential for curative approaches here. But I think we shouldn't forget that these days everything just moves a lot faster than it did 20 years ago. So just communication and everything, basically. We've seen that with the COVID vaccine development. I don't think we could have done anything like that 20 years ago. So I think there is also this slight distortion of timelines through just general advances in technology.
Yeah, that's a fair comment.
I don't agree, Kirsten, because if you sit and look at even immune therapy development, it's still taking place over the same timescale. So COVID is an unusual one. Yes, we've managed to do it. But I think it really is the strength of the data and the curative nature that's kind of driven the speed more than technology around that in terms of communication.
Okay, one of the other trends that, just following on from that Charles River identified, was actually quite interesting, because it showed that in the monoclonal era, late stage assets were highly prized. So phase 3 or even post-marketing approval assets were what big pharma focused on and paid the highest valuations for. What they're seeing now is, in fact, a real interest from big pharma in partnering assets at almost any stage. So some discovery stage assets where there's no data at all, which sounds a bit surprising to me, but also early stage assets, not just the late stage ones. And they're commanding decent valuations. The other aspect of this is that single asset deals are much less common for cell and gene therapy. And picking up what you were saying, Michael, the data seems to show that big pharma wants a bundle of assets, but they also want some sort of platform technology as well. So the manufacturing capability, the discovery capability, in addition just to a single asset or even a multi-asset focused deal. Again, what are you seeing about that? How do you react to that observation? Do you think that's a fair analysis of the data, and does that reflect what you're seeing in the market?
I think it's a fair analysis of the data, because if you sit and think about the majority of large pharma, they've got a bunch of biologics. Then you can sit and think, well, a CAR T fundamentally is a platform. Could I then address the targets of my biologics using my CAR T platform or some other cell therapy or other modified cell? And therefore, you suddenly see that it's a platform play that they're all really going for, rather than going for a single target, which is what used to be the game. So you can see a kind of shift in mindset slightly from where things used to be.
And the willingness to engage early on, even before there's significant data?
Because everybody's out. I think everybody's out there looking for this type of technology. So 10 years ago, you probably would be able to snap up a TCR or a CAR T therapy for a few £1 million at an early stage development. You're going to struggle to do that nowadays. And that's partly because the data is now supporting that these are very curative therapies and therefore potentially very valuable, even in a rare disease.
I think you also find out whether you've got the potential for success earlier than a biological, definitely than a small molecule, but based on a small cohort of patients. You can assign a completely different probability of success. So you're investing less to get to a value inflection point. So you might start from a platform perspective and push into 1 or 2 clinical studies, and you'll find out very quickly whether something is investable all the way through the other end. Big pharma don't mind investing a lot of money in something that they know that works. That's why biologics space this tend to pick things off at the back end, because that's when they know it's worked and it's precious control. But I think in a advanced therapy setting, that you can take that risk and maybe take that decision a bit earlier.
Yeah, because you're generally running phase 1-2 trials, so it's named patients who already have disease, so you've got a good sniff that it's safe, and there's a good sniff that it's efficacious as well, if not curative in some of those patients.
Maybe
sorry, Chris, go ahead. No,
maybe
go ahead.
the landscape will evolve and change. I think there are very few late stage assets at the moment. So you have to look early if you want to get in the game. But I think there continues to be a lot of investment outside of large pharma in developing therapies and also seeing them through to late stage development within biotech. So I think 5 years time it will look completely different. I hope it will.
And for those of you who focus on business development in particular and deal analysis, are there any rules of thumb that you would be willing to share around sort of upfronts and milestones, depending on stage of asset, or is it completely deal specific, asset specific?
Well, don't be surprised that you're going to build milestones in much earlier to both to kind of demonstrate that you've got diligence in your partner. So, for example, it could be scale up of your manufacturing at different levels, or potentially creation of GMP cell lines and different things that will need to be passed. So you don't just think that the first time you're actually going to have to pay a milestone is going to be when you file a BLA or an IND.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Chris, did you have any thoughts on that?
I think I think Michael's observation is a good one. I think largely it comes down to the value of asset and the probability of success and how much a partner has to invest to get it to market. And that's what drives deal terms. I think structurally, we tend to have to think about the royalty provision slightly differently. There are lots of layers to the products we develop in advanced therapies in ex vivo cell therapies, but also gene therapies. Different pieces of IP that have been in license from lots of different places. And how do you deal with a royalty stack? And that's where we often focus a lot of attention. I don't know if that was different. I wasn't around in the MAP days, but I don't know if it's different than back then. But it's certainly a challenge now.
Yeah, sure. The other thing another observation that Charles River made was that we're seeing more licensing and partnering compared to M&A in the cell and gene therapy space. So despite the data that you've talked about, creating competitive tension, but also real interest in the potential of the modality, we are seeing big pharma, I think, thinking, presumably from a risk point of view, in terms of the upfront capital commitment would be lower if they did a partnering deal, a licensing deal, rather than if they did M&A. Now, there may be some exceptions to that. I think there have been some notable acquisitions at quite high valuations. Chris, Michael, do you want to give your thoughts on that dichotomy between the licensing and the M&A?
Well, I think it's just part of the history of big pharma, to be honest. So I think there is the realization that the model, while isn't entirely broken, it's not as slick as it used to be. So they can't just turn the handle and throw out a whole bunch of small molecules, which can then take to market. They realize that they need some nimble biotechs doing that kind of basic, really risky research to figure out what they can do and how they can apply their platforms to a variety of different problems. Therefore, it's a partnering type deal. It's a collaborative type transaction rather than absorbing them into the large pharmaceutical industry itself, bringing it into in-house, because it can stifle the innovation. You need the open innovation, and it's everybody within big pharma is doing that. They're always out looking for new partnerships. But for these types of technologies, which are so reliant on such a mosaic of other technologies to bring together, before, to create the medicine itself, you need somebody who's smaller and more nimble, who can get on and look at different things. So it really does work a lot better to be collaborative rather than it being absorbed and then working to each other's strengths, whereas the large pharma's got the routes to market and knows how to create the product, how to get market access, work on that. That's your skill set. Let somebody else deal with the technology.
Kirsten, do you have any sort of thoughts on deal valuation or deal structure? I mean, clearly there were, I think going back to 2017, there was some notable M&A when Gilead bought Kite, Cell Gene bought Juno, and then got obviously bought itself by BMS. And I think those deals were largely driven by the CAR T therapies, the CAR T assets that Kite and Juno had respectively. And they attracted high valuations. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, $4 billion, I think, for one of them, and 11 billion for the other. So those were high upfronts that the big pharma partners were willing to pay to capture those assets. But then we've seen a number of deals sort of with upfronts around the, you know, in the single the tens of millions of dollars. Clearly, presumably for therapies which have smaller markets or less promise. So there seems to be a big variety in what's going on. I guess there's no difference there than there always was even in the antibody space.
Yeah, so I think what you've observed with Kite and Juno is it's a late stage acquisition of a really well-developed portfolio with an early stage groundbreaking technology, right? So that is really rare in a sense. I mostly have experience with dealing at very early stage deals. And I think what we see there is a reflection of this platform approach that we discussed earlier, where the pharma are not really interested in buying into the whole platform before they see it pans out, but are more comfortable with licensing in a certain asset, which is aligned with their strategy. So that's why I think we have seen a lot of these partnering deals, also for the reasons that Michael already mentioned, rather than maybe acquisition of the whole company, right? In these more molecular antibody space, you have a lot of single asset companies that are then easy to acquire through an M&A deal because they are just that one asset. Whereas obviously here we're dealing with much broader platform plays usually.
Yeah, and given the size of the patient populations can be small, does that mean that the cost of clinical development is correspondingly less? So does that mean it's more feasible for these companies actually to go the whole distance themselves without partnering assets? Or is that the costs are still sufficiently high for it to be difficult to raise funding from venture or from capital markets in order to do that and go the whole way?
I think if you look at what's happening in the kind of rare disease market, because there is usually not a standard of care, I think that has significantly sped up the development in the clinic, because results for these patients were so groundbreaking in the early stage clinical trials that it was basically unethical to withhold the treatment from the patients. So these medicines have made it through to the market in much shorter timelines than what you would usually observe. So that's definitely a draw towards these types of indications with much smaller patient populations.
Okay, interesting. And in the last few minutes we've got, before we take some questions, if there are any, let's just spend a couple of minutes thinking about actually the deal terms themselves and the drafting. Chris, you talked about royalty stacking clauses and the importance of those and something that's difficult to negotiate in your experience. In terms of the duration of the deals, are we seeing anything in terms of, as Kirsten said right at the top of the call, if you have reimbursement models which are sort of annuity based, so that rather than paying up front, a payer will be paying over the course of a number of years in order to make the high cost more affordable. Does that drive different approaches to the duration, like the term of your deal, to make sure that you're not losing some of that value? Or are you not really seeing that as a concern? Because at the moment, most reimbursement models are still upfront lump sum.
I guess we only receive a share of the spoils when our partner receives it. So from that perspective, I don't think an annuity-based reimbursement model affects how you would address sort of the royalty term. I don't know if it's something I've not really thought about, Adrian. I don't know if others have any view on that.
Connor, have you got any thoughts on that issue or anything else in particular in terms of drafting? We talked offline a bit about net sales definitions or different milestones, which Michael has also raised.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that some of the structure of the deals that you're going to see, some of it will be reminiscent of small molecule and large molecule licenses and that sort of stuff. I mean, from my perspective, having also spoken with a few friends who are, really active in the space as well, there are a couple of, I guess, key themes that emerge. One is that, I mean, it sounds really trivial, but the definition of product, but the definition of product is key to the license grant itself and what you pay, the net sales, what you're paying on. And it's easy to define a product when you've got a definable molecule, but when your product changes from patient to patient, for example, it can be, you could see how there could easily be a bit of a pushing and shoving between a licensor and a licensee as to what that looks like in terms of the definition. In terms of the royalties themselves, I mean, I think again, it's compare and contrast between the small molecule and large molecule world that we're used to, I guess. You're used to having a step down when the generics or biosimilars enter the space, but it's not immediately clear to me exactly what form that would take in this case. When the IP and the regulatory protections expire, what form is that entry going to look like? And in all honesty, I've got more questions than answers right now in terms of how we would structure. But I agree that the stacking is absolutely key, just because there is so many technology platforms that you're going to have to use as a company to get your product into a patient. If you haven't got a good stacking system in place, you're going to be looking at the wrong end of a very high royalty stack indeed. Yeah, that's very interesting. So I think we've got 2 minutes left. That's been an absolutely enthralling discussion. Thank you all for your contributions. Do we have any questions from people who are listening? If we have, then please chip in. Put them on the chat, and we'll do what we can to address them in the last few minutes.
Yeah, so I can see a question from Guy. So I don't know if Guy, you're still around and you would like to ask your question, or happy to read it for you. Yeah, there he is. That would be easier if you ask yourself.
Unmute, yes. Maybe I shorten it. Just curious on the panel's experience, what's going to happen with reimbursement and whether, I guess mainly whether efficacy will be factored into those payments. So there was a bit of mention about annuities there. And then do you think we're going to have to tie in patient monitoring to evaluate that?
Michael, have you got any thoughts on that? I know the Catapult did a lot of work on reimbursement models.
So I think it's going to go that way, because at the moment you've got a lot of data support. As we said, these things are quite transformative. They can be curative, but we have no long-term data. Yes, you can look at, once again, back to Emily Whitehead, it's 9 years, she's still cancer-free, but there are other patients who have had relapses in a number of years, and we don't really understand why. And so you can see regulators will be slightly nervous about giving big upfront payments on the first year of after treatment, and want to maybe share that risk with the manufacturer of the medicine. And from discussions at the Catapult, we can see that there's a number of other organizations who feel that's fair, and they feel that yes, we will share the risk with the regulator and with the patient effectively, and take our money over a number of years as things go out. But the problem is the regulators and how they're funded and how they pay things is much more on an annual basis. Therefore, they're struggling a little bit to be able to accommodate those types of models. So it's a kind of tension between these large upfronts, which are necessary to pay for the medicine because they're expensive to manufacture, fighting against, we don't have any data to justify that this is going to be a one-off curative event, and then trying to figure out how they can then manage their own internal funds to spread any risk and payments over a number of years. So it's a bit chicken and egg at the moment, but I think there is a movement in the industry to accommodate this type of problem.
And is the thinking, Michael, that there would be the upfront, but then there would be monitoring and clawback if there was a relapse? Or are people thinking there would be payment by installments so that you have a chance to see whether there is going to be a relapse, and then
more payment by installment?
Okay.
I guess it can't have a long-term view, because it would create a real cash flow problem for the industry, and in terms of delivering these therapies to patients.
Yeah. So it's trying to get the balance.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
One thing we do have in advanced therapies is long-term requirements to monitor the patients. So there's sort of the REMS requirement with the FDA, which looks forward, I think it's 10, 15 years in terms of monitoring. It really depends on the type of therapy you're delivering, but if you're delivering genetic material to a patient and there's a risk of a transformation event, then you have to monitor those patients long term.
Yeah. Guy, thanks very much for your question. Any other questions before we draw to a close?
I can't see any, so I think I would say if you have one, this is now or not. And I think that will be a not, because we're already past 2. So I would say if you have any questions to panelists or Adrienne, I'm sure they will be very happy to provide their detail or to be contacted on any specific question. Just a huge thank you to the panel. I thought that was really, really insightful, a really good overview, and reminding us, why this very challenging area is worth it. This is curative potential, and that's why we're all here discussing why and how we can overcome that. I felt that it covered quite a lot in an hour, which is really good to have an overview, but maybe there would be an opportunity for deepening on some aspects of due diligence or valuation or more, deal making and all of that. And I'd be happy to explore that if any of you in the virtual audience or panel would like to do that further. So as I said, this session was recorded. I will circulate the link afterward, and you can obviously share it with colleagues or contacts you have who are interested in the space. So again, a big thank you to everyone for attending, and huge thank you to the panel. It was a really great session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.